thank you everyone for coming today. It's just really gratifying to have such an amazing audience with so many great experts in a number of different fields related to challenge studies and pandemic preparedness and vaccinology. Wanted to first thank Danica and Jasmine for putting this event together, and everyone else who helped put this event together for doing a really great job. I'm really excited and really lucky to have them on the team. I also just feel really indebted to a lot of the experts we have today. I think the United Kingdom should really feel a sense of pride for being the first and only country to run COVID challenge studies. And I think the people who are in this room are several of the people who took the lead in doing that work. And we're also joined by some of the people who were research participants in those studies. And I think both deserve a great deal of credit, and I'm really honored to be in the same room with them, and I'm really excited to hear their perspective. I don't think it's surprising that the UK was the first to do challenge studies, because the UK has been a global leader in infectious disease and vaccinology in a way that manifested itself in kind of a few different important successes throughout the pandemic, of which COVID challenge studies are one, and also, of course, the work that Oxford and Dr. Pollard did on their vaccine with AstraZeneca. And I think that leadership, kind of extended to when the UK had the kind of secretariat for the G7, announcing this 100-day mission to prepare for future pandemics and have the goal of being able to kind of test vaccines and other countermeasures, other therapeutics and diagnostics in advance of a pandemic, so that during a future pandemic, we can do a better job than was done during COVID. And I think the motivation for this report that we're announcing and launching today kind of came out of a similar idea that there's always ways to improve, and I think that for the future we want to make sure that challenge studies can be utilized pre-pandemic as part of the development of these kind of prototype countermeasures, and that there's a good plan in place to be able to use challenge studies when they're ethically appropriate for future pandemics in a kind of optimally useful and optimally safe. And so it's really been a great honor and pleasure to get to work with Julian and Bridget and Dominic on this report. And I think that the work they did is really incredible, and I think it really is a forward step in thinking about these issues of pandemic preparedness and how challenge studies can be used for them. And I also think it really lays out a really good program for further progress. With that, I will turn it over to Bridget and Dominic to tell you a little bit about the conclusions of the report.
There we are. I'm Dominic Wilkinson. I'm Professor of Medical Ethics at the University of Oxford. I, like you, I imagine, have been thinking in the last week back 3 years to the spring sunshine, the birdsong, and the empty streets of the start of the pandemic. And this report takes us back to that time, to that point when we were faced with a novel pandemic. But before we go back, I want you to step forwards 4 years to a fictional pandemic that's described in Kate Kellen's book, Disease X, available next door in the bookshop if you're interested. Sadly, she can't join us this evening as she had planned. She describes a new pandemic in early 2027 in the fictional Southeast Asian country of Shamposa, a pandemic that looks more lethal than COVID. Early vaccine candidates are being tried. It seems at the present time that the virus is confined to Shamposa, but their hospitals are overrun. And there's a great desire to think about challenge studies. Could we, in the UK, do a challenge study to accelerate vaccine development to really make a difference? Well, there are 3 risks. We might embark on an inappropriate challenge study with serious risks for the UK population, of course, for those who are involved in the study. We might forego that challenge study. We might be too afraid to take that bold step, and there might be thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands lives as lost. Or we might simply take too long. We might prevaricate. And the concern that we would take too long or not be able to make those decisions is what led to this report. I'm going to hand over to Bridget, who did all the hard work behind this report, to explain in detail what it's about.
Thanks, Dominic. That's very kind. I'm assuming this is a clicker. Yeah. Okay. First of all, thanks very much for coming. It's really great to see so many people here. And thanks to Josh and Danica and Jasmine for putting on this event. So I realise this room probably doesn't need much of an introduction to challenge studies, but I'm going to give a brief one anyway, so sorry about that. Controlled human infection model studies, or challenge studies, are obviously nothing new. So one of the most famous challenge studies is the inoculation of 8-year-old James Phipps by Edward Jenner and then exposure to smallpox, which I think happened in the late, I think in like 1797 or something like that. Since then, challenge studies have been conducted with many infectious diseases, from malaria, influenza, cholera, just to name a few. They can help us to understand disease, particularly the initial stages of an infection and things like the incubation period in particular, and how a virus infects the body and the patterns of viral shedding. Challenge studies can also help us to evaluate and develop vaccines, therapeutics, and novel diagnostic tests as well. However, so far, most challenge studies have happened with diseases that cause a mild illness or for which there's effectively a cure available, or they've been conducted with attenuated pathogens, so rather than the most harmful pathogen itself. There has been less work done, or relatively underexplored, is challenge studies with pathogens with pandemic potential. So the definition of a pathogen with pandemic potential is something that can be discussed. For this report, we took it to mean pathogens that were both highly virulent and highly transmissible. So challenge studies with pathogens with pandemic potential, or pandemic pathogens, involve a few differences to challenge studies with other diseases. So firstly, they'll generally involve more uncertainty. So particularly if it's an outbreak with a novel virus, there's a lot of uncertainty in what the infection will look like and the implications for participants in the study. Secondly, the scale of risks and benefits is likely to be larger, so both in terms of potentially a greater risk for individual participants, but also a greater risk of an outbreak spreading, particularly if a study is being conducted when there isn't virus circulating in a community. But the flip side of that is that the benefits are also going to be larger if the risks are larger as well, generally. In the setting of a pandemic in particular, there'll be an additional issue of resource scarcity. So both laboratories and clinical care will be stressed and placed under pressure, and greater pressure than usual. And finally, there'll also often be a greater sense of urgency. So when there's exponential spread happening, days can really, really matter. Okay, so Josh has mentioned the report, and obviously COVID-19 highlighted a lot of the differences between conducting a challenge study with a pandemic pathogen and other challenge studies. And I think part of that was the impetus for this report. So this report aimed to evaluate and provide guidance on conducting challenge studies with pandemic pathogens, and also provide some recommendations. So to conduct this report, we firstly reviewed the literature, so both the academic discussion of ethical issues, but also the available guidance, existing guidance on conducting ethical challenge studies, including this WHO guidance from 2020. We then interviewed a series of experts to, I guess, get a better understanding of the context of challenge studies, and also to hear from people who are most involved with challenge studies about their perspectives on ethical issues involved with challenge studies with pandemic pathogens. And finally, we underwent a process of ethical analysis and developed a framework and set of recommendations, and then developed a draft and got input from both the experts that we had interviewed and also some other experts, and iterated on the draft. So this is the framework that we came up with. A lot of the content here overlaps with existing frameworks like the WHO guidance that I mentioned initially, and also the UK's Health Research Authority's checklists for research ethics committees for normal studies, or usual studies, everyday studies. However, the structure of our framework is a little bit different because we focus on these two major questions. So firstly, is the study in the public interest? And then secondly, does the study satisfy other ethical requirements? So for the first question, we think there's three major sub-questions. So is there a valid scientific rationale? Do expected benefits justify expected harms? Which we think is probably one of the key and most difficult questions in this framework. And then, is this the best method to achieve benefits? And then there's a procedural component about there being an external review to agree with the decision to that question. And then the second question is about making sure that the study is otherwise ethical. So is there a fair and comprehensive system of compensation? Is there a process to ensure that consent is voluntary and sufficiently informed? Is the recruitment process fair and are vulnerable groups protected? Are the interests of the local community protected? And is there a comprehensive plan for communication? From this, we developed 3 major recommendations, which somehow, in some ways, follow the structure of the report. So the first one is looking at that first major question. So we recommend establishing a clear mechanism for determining when a challenge study with a pathogen with pandemic potential is in the public interest. The second recommendation is looking at the second part of the framework, so aiming to ensure that there are procedures and in place to streamline the ethics review of challenge studies with pathogens with pandemic potential. And then finally, we want to make sure that there is the infrastructure and expertise to conduct challenge studies when they're required. Okay, so I'll go through the sub-recommendations. So firstly, that key difficult question, I think, is one that really needs some more thought. And we recommend developing a process for answering that question. So for deciding when the benefits of a study justify the harms. So we think this is, in the report, we outline one approach to developing a process like this. However, we think it's far from perfect. We also think that this is something that should be developed with some democratic input. So input from the public and also experts in a range of different fields. We also think that this is the type of question that needs to be answered, or the type of question that should have a process in place to answer it ahead of time. So this isn't the type of question that you want to be putting to decision makers in the middle of a crisis when they are sleep deprived and have many decisions to make. So there are a couple of things that we think could help in developing this process. So the first is developing models which quantify the risks and benefits of challenge studies. So I think a lot of people are a bit skeptical about excessive quantification. And I think that that skepticism is justified. I think there is a risk of relying too much on quantitative models, particularly for something that's very complex like this. However, I also think there's a risk in not identifying all the relevant considerations. So I think one thing that models can help us do is to outline all of the important outcomes that we care about and try to think through key areas of uncertainty. Something else that we think could be really helpful is considering example scenarios. So perhaps one like the Champosen outbreak that Dominic mentioned in the beginning. And then having groups of experts in the public to deliberate around these scenarios to identify what they think are the key factors for answering this question. So something that came up a lot in discussion around the COVID-19 challenge study was this risk of a challenge study harming public trust in science and vaccines. However, this is something that is really hard to know what would happen or what the effect of challenge studies would be on public sentiment towards science and vaccines. So we suggest developing methods to, I guess, gauge public response to challenge studies and understand public sentiment and be able to monitor it as well. And we think there's also value in developing educational materials, both for policymakers and the public, to explain what challenge studies are, what they're used for, some of their risks and some of their benefits and limitations. And then finally, we think that it would be important to establish a group charged with making this judgment. So ordinarily, for most research in the UK, a research ethics committee will make an assessment of whether a study has an equitable balance of risks and benefits. However, particularly in a public health emergency, we think that it's probably going to be better if there's a wider range of voices. So particularly the benefits and the benefits of a study will be really closely linked with government policy. There's also likely to be greater public attention on a study. So for that reason, we think that answering this question is probably something that should have a wider input of voices. Okay, and then for our second recommendation, which is focused on streamlining the ethics review of these studies. So first, for the COVID-19 challenge study, a specialist research ethics committee was put together. We think that this is a good idea, and it would be good to maintain a specialist research ethics committee. We also think it would be appropriate to adapt the existing Health Research Authority checklist for reviewing the ethics of challenge studies to include details relevant to conducting challenge studies with pandemic pathogens. We think that value in creating template protocols, and something that could be included in those template protocols is special informed consent procedures. So challenge studies with pandemic pathogens involve a lot of uncertainty, potentially involve high risk. So we think that there's an argument to be made for having, I guess, more detailed consent procedures. So possibly requiring a check for understanding, particularly understanding of risk and uncertainty. We also suggest reviewing the approach to compensation. So the Health Research Authority doesn't recommend compensating participants for risk. However, we think that there are good reasons, particularly reasons of fairness, to compensate participants for the risk that they undertake in engaging in a study. So we suggest reviewing that and potentially conducting qualitative research to be able to identify the amount of payment that is going to be fair but not overly coercive. And we also suggest developing a template communications plan. So particularly in a public health emergency, communications is going to be really important. So it seems good to have a plan in place for communicating with the public, local communities, and also distributing the research results. Okay, so for the final main recommendation. So first, we think it would be useful to develop a report on the UK's capacity to conduct challenge studies and to understand what the impact of a challenge study in an emergency would be on both clinical and research workforces. We think that it would be good to have a better understanding of the potential value of challenge studies in pandemic preparedness. So there's a lot of ways that challenge studies could be useful in pandemic preparedness. They could be particularly useful for developing a library of vaccines for prototype pathogens, particularly vaccines that are aiming to block transmission. However, there are also other things that could be invested in for pandemic preparedness. So we think it's appropriate to look at these things carefully and come to a judgment on, or have more of a discussion around the role of challenge studies in pandemic planning. So something that came up a lot in the interviews with experts was the fact that developing, or the time required to develop challenge stock, or like sufficient stock of the challenge agent, was a key limitation on the timing of challenge studies. And in a situation where timing is really important, it also could be a key limitation on the value of challenge studies. So we recommend investigating ways that that we might be able to accelerate the production of challenge agent, and also potentially look into when, if ever, it's appropriate to use challenge agent that isn't conducted to GMP, or good manufacturing practice standards. Related to this, we also think there's a role for investigating the potential for other types of studies, so particularly person-to-person transmission studies. And finally, we suggest developing a roadmap. So based on the research that's done beforehand, developing a roadmap for ensuring that there is the capacity to conduct challenge studies in the UK when that's thought to be appropriate. So those are the recommendations again. I'm really looking forward to hearing the panelists' thoughts on these and what the next steps are from here. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Should also acknowledge the people who have contributed to the report as well. Thank you. Oh, we've got 5 minutes for questions. So.
Questions at this stage. There'll be lots more time for questions. We'll get the conversational juices flowing over the next hour, I'm sure. I mean, as I think you'll have sensed from this report, so one of the things we went into this report thinking was that we could come up with some simple ethical formula for working out when challenge trials could go ahead. But there isn't any way to generate that, apart from anything else. Even if we were to generate such an answer, there's no guarantee that other people would agree with the answer that we came up with for this fictional Champosen outbreak or for any other. So sometimes what we need to think about is not necessarily the substantive answer, but the process, getting the process right, and making it as good as possible. We know that we will face future pandemics, and we know that we will face these questions about challenge studies. I guess the essence of this report is to try and take us from here to a better position to evaluate that question in a future pandemic. Jonas.
Hi, I'm Jonas Sandbrink, one of Dominic's students. Excellent presentation, thank you so much. One thing that I've been wondering about is especially thinking about the scenario of a future pandemic that is potentially has a worse lethality or is actually, much more lethal across all age groups, across all populations, and therefore there's maybe not a clear target where you can challenge someone without kind of very high risk to them personally. And I wonder how you think about the range of applications of challenge studies across these different scenarios of pandemics, and how that would be if potentially lethality or personal risk is 10% or something of that order.
Bridget, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult question when you are talking about very high risks. And, you know, I think it's probably going to be a very different situation to what we saw with COVID, when there was a lot of people very interested in participating in challenge studies. But in this situation, that might not be the case. And yeah, I don't have a very good answer to you, Jonas, I'm sorry.
So, I mean, I guess the risk is higher, the benefit is higher. If we have an incredibly lethal pandemic, there's a huge amount at stake. I guess there are going to be several different limits to the tolerable risk threshold. One is going to be a fundamental one. If there's nobody willing to do a challenge trial, it's not going to happen. The second is, what's the level of willingness of the community? And so one of the things in the report is to say, we need to have a sense of the comfort level of the community with casualties in challenge trials. Our community's understands that some of our armed forces die. That's a sacrifice that people enter the armed forces knowing that they might make. Of course, if it gets too high, then they start to lose their support for the government of the day and the particular military action. And then, of course, there's the comfort level of the decision makers, the ethics committees. In this case, the specific ethics risk question wants to wall off to a different group. So there's the comfort level of that group. What level of risk are they going to be willing to embark on in a challenge trial? We don't know where that level is. There's going to be a level that's too high. We need to try and have the best process that we can to not embark on inappropriate challenge studies, because I guess that's also part of the answer here. We shouldn't be doing challenge studies some of the time, but when there is a sufficient ethical case, to make sure that we don't miss out on that opportunity. So Bernard.
Hello, Bernard Silverman. I'm a statistician, and I do this and that. Now, I think actually, in answer to the previous question, if you had a very highly transmissible disease and it hit everybody, you wouldn't need to perform challenge studies because you'd be having a natural experiment all the time. So the thing is, because there'd be so much infection around that it would be different altogether. It would be a matter of recruiting people to be prepared to try some risky vaccine or something. So actually, if I may say, I don't think your point is, this isn't a scenario one should worry about. Of course, COVID was a kind of dream scenario for challenge studies because it was known from the very beginning that it was so age dependent that if you were young and fit, it was already known that it was safe. So in fact, it was a sort of ideal situation where a challenge trial could have been done much earlier. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I want to say is, I want to ask the panel questions later, but we can come to that, is It's around whether we should start thinking about challenge trials, not just for pandemics, but for all sorts of different things. Challenge trials, in my view, should be just part of the normal process of medical research, because there are so many other examples of where challenge trials might be helpful of one sort and another. And it has been going on with things like cold research for a very long time. So one issue is actually to try and normalize the whole idea of challenge trials to population and say this is just one of the things that's done normally. And then there will be, I think, people won't get so alarmed about it when what you have is a novel disease or pathogen, rather than the ones that are around all the time anyway.
Thank you. So we've got a number of experts who are involved in challenge trials in peacetime here. And in fact, our report, I'll hand over to Bridget to talk about it, but does make indeed that recommendation that challenge trials in non-pandemic times are important for all the reasons that you point out in terms of community understanding and willingness, but also in terms of infrastructure, capacity, and the ability to then do a challenge trial during a pandemic.
Yeah, that's right. That's another thing that came out a lot in the interviews was the benefit and the importance of maintaining, I guess, readiness to conduct challenge studies. And of course, there are a lot of challenge studies that are done with a range of diseases at the moment, but we probably don't hear about them as much. And I think there's probably scope to do more challenge studies as well. But it does seem like the UK is kind of well placed to conduct challenge studies, and yeah, something we recommend the port is making sure that can continue.
Good. We're going to move on to the panel discussion. There will be lots more time for questions.
Thank you.
Hello everyone. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay, good. I'm Elizabeth Mahays, a journalist from the British Medical Journal. I'm very happy to be chairing this panel tonight, and we have some great panelists. But I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I just firstly want to say we were also going to be joined by Kate Kelland, but unfortunately she can't make it tonight. But as we've heard, she has an excellent book out, and it is available next door. Please do buy it. So Shabana, do you want to start? Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Shobana Balasingham. I'm the research lead for the Human Challenge Programme at Wellcome.
I'm Chris Chu. I am a professor of infectious diseases at Imperial College London. I've been running human challenge studies with respiratory viruses for over a decade now, and I was the chief investigator of the first SARS-CoV-2 human challenge study.
I'm Peter Openshaw. I'm professor of experimental medicine at Imperial College. And I guess I've been doing human experimentation in one form or another right back to when I was a medical student. And at the moment, I'm the director of the HICVAC program, which is supported by the MRC to try to promote the use of human infection challenge for pathogens of global importance. Co-director, Andy Pollard.
And I'm Andy Pollard. I'm director of the Oxford Vaccine Group at the University of Oxford. I've been working on vaccine development for about 25 years, and over the last 15 years involved in human challenge studies, mostly with bacteria rather than viruses. In Oxford, we have 8 challenge models that are used at the moment in answer to the question about peacetime challenge models across a wide variety of pathogens, parasites, viruses, and bacteria. And I think they are absolutely there as part of the development of vaccines and understanding the biology for many different pathogens. And I think accepted very much increasingly by funders and by ethics committees, actually. So, yeah, I think it's right in the mainstream these days.
Brilliant. So we've heard a bit about the barriers to challenge studies, and I wanted to draw on all of your experience on this. But maybe we can start with Chris and Peter as well. What was it like starting a challenge study during the pandemic, and what were the kind of barriers that you faced?
Yeah, so I was just saying that as Bridget was going through her slides, it felt like a flashback to 2020, 2021, because every single point that you highlighted were things that we had to deal with and had to make considered evidence-based judgments on in the heat of the new pandemic. And I think that, to me, was the biggest challenge, that there was lots of new data coming along. The whole pandemic environment was changing very rapidly as we were trying to develop a study and a model and assess all of these potential risks and the knowns and the unknowns. And I think that we're now in a much better place because we have had that experience of thinking through all those issues, even though it was in the heat of the moment. As others have said, we really benefit in the UK from having a very long history of safe and high quality human challenge models and groups which are experienced in that. And we were able, through the HICVAC network and our existing relationships with what is still quite a small field, to draw on that experience very rapidly and to try and address some of those questions in the heat of the moment. I think it was still a long and drawn-out process, obviously. Bridget's already talked about the time it took to manufacture challenge agent, and that needs to be addressed. And I think there are strategies to address that going forward. And again, Bridget has said that probably the biggest question for us, and what we spent a long time discussing and going backwards and forwards with, and rediscussing as new data came out, new papers were pre-printed, was this question about the unknown risks, or the potential for unknown risks, along with the potential benefits. And certainly when we came to the ethics committee and having our protocol reviewed, this was something that we went backwards and forwards with to the ethics committee several times. And so those are all barriers and reasons why it took about a year to get the study off the ground. But sort of trying to end on an optimistic note, a lot of those things can be addressed through preparation. And I think it's great that this report highlights some of those things that we need to do to achieve that.
Brilliant. Chris, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think, absolutely agree with everything Chris said. I think it's so important to have everything aligned to be able to do these studies. So it's not just the details of how the study's being done, but you need the funders to be on board, you need to have facilities for producing virus, you need facilities for care of the volunteers. Everything needs to be set up to run at the same time, and I think there was a quite unique alignment. I guess looking back, something I regret is that we didn't go on to do coronavirus challenge after SARS. Back in 2003, we discussed it at the time. We thought it'd be really good if somebody was doing coronavirus challenge, but there was no real momentum to do that at that time. I think we were focused on RSV and on influenza, but it's so important to have things up and running in peacetime, if you're going to be able to respond and get this alignment of all of the different elements that you need for challenge studies in an acute event.
Brilliant. And if you had been able to start earlier, Chris and Peter, on your challenge study in COVID and been able to get results out sooner, do you think it would have changed anything significantly in terms of vaccines, treatments, maybe the way we responded to the pandemic? Would you like to take it over, Andrew?
I think it's an important question, and of course it's very difficult to look back and know the answer to that. I mean, really the situation in the pandemic was the regulators wanted to have field efficacy data, and those were across all of the vaccines which eventually developed got set up and underway remarkably quickly. And I think in the context of a pandemic where there was quite a high attack rate, you can, as I think was being suggested, you can get your answer relatively quickly through delivery of those. Now, I think when you look back, and I think that the name One Day Soon is an important one, because every day 10,000 people globally died during 2020. So if you look back and say, could we have found a way of saving a few days through using a challenge model, then if the answer was yes to that, then absolutely. Perhaps the other way of looking at it is that you could have had more prolonged lockdowns, saved people's lives by not opening up so quickly, and used other mechanisms to test vaccines earlier. Now, at the moment, regulators wouldn't have accepted those data because the challenge models are a slightly artificial situation. You wouldn't involve the very elderly in those initial challenge models, so you wouldn't get the answer that the regulators would need to say, yes, we're going to give billions of doses of these vaccines. So it's difficult to know. There are definitely circumstances, and maybe by looking at COVID, we're looking at the wrong pandemic to answer the question. We already knew, we'd had 20 years of research, as Peter said, on coronavirus vaccines. We already had the platform set up, and it was a fairly trivial decision to make a vaccine we already knew was going to work because we had so much data. If we were dealing with a pathogen that we didn't know so well, I think, we didn't have evidence, we couldn't make the vaccine work in animals, you couldn't get there quickly, then human testing, whilst you were trying to mitigate with the non-pharmaceutical interventions like social distancing and so on, might be absolutely critical. So I think probably less critical in COVID, but it could be absolutely critical in a future pandemic where we don't have 20 years of research on how to make a vaccine.
And thinking about those kind of the pandemic preparedness, future pandemics, obviously the government has set this 100-day mission. So it's to reduce the impact of future pandemics by making diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines available within 100 days. What role do you think challenge studies play in that?
Well, I think that really comes to this point of preparedness as what you're doing in peacetime. To use the challenge models in a pandemic to get there in 100 days and answer all the questions that we'd have about how they should be deployed would be really tough. But if you've done the homework beforehand, using experimental medicine setup, I think you can answer a lot of the questions that we can't answer in the field. The difficulty there is that when there isn't a pandemic, that risk-benefit bit that Dominic was highlighting is much more tricky.
Anyone like to add anything? Yeah, Chris.
I was just going to add to what Andy said. So, yes, it's true that, you know, the pandemic, this particular pandemic, sort of progressed rapidly, and the vaccine development, fortunately, went very smoothly, and we had highly effective vaccines. But I don't think that was necessarily guaranteed, despite everything that we knew about coronaviruses. This was a new pathogen, and also, you know, we weren't sure whether the vaccines were going to be 50 or 60% effective or 95% effective, which they turned out to be. So I think, you know, in retrospect, we can say, you know, we didn't need it, but actually at the time, I think the government and the vaccine task force in the UK thought that this was a valid mitigation strategy in case those first round of vaccines were not optimal. And then you would have a whole range of potential candidates which might have different technologies or mechanisms of action that hadn't been sort of tested before in the same way that the more sort of well-established vaccine platforms had been. And then you might need that human challenge program or platform to triage your different candidates. Because despite the fact that millions of people are getting the infection around the world, there's only a limited number of researchers and limited number of sites which can do trials, and a limited amount of money to do them with. So I think that there still potentially was a role for the model in that setting. And I think in the inter-pandemic period, I think there is a lot that we need to understand about the biology of these, prototypic viruses probably that we know still very little about in terms of pathogenesis and immunity and transmission and so on. And those data, those findings can be applied to the selection of better first round vaccines if we have the processes for that.
Brilliant. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think just like to add that this isn't happening in a vacuum, and that all the other studies that are going on at the same time, understanding the pathogenesis in field studies, in hospital studies, in studies of people who are domestic contacts, for example, this can be vastly informative, and we wouldn't have been able to respond in the way that we did to the 2009 swine flu pandemic or to this pandemic if we hadn't had infrastructure in place that had been funded perhaps for slightly related purposes. And this ongoing funding of the teams that are working in peacetime on these pathogens is so important if we're going to be able to respond by doing challenge studies and by doing all these other studies running in parallel. And that this isn't in isolation. We have to have an infrastructure present. We have to have teams in place. We had the Centre for Respiratory Infection, which was funded by the Wellcome Trust just before in 2008, just before the 2009 pandemic. We'd had the HICVAC consortium set up and running with brilliant people who were in place and ready to go, and long-term support from the Wellcome to study these pathogens. Without all of that, we couldn't have responded as we did in the UK, I think.
Can I just add, it'd be nice to have an argument with Chris, but I do agree with the points that Chris made. I was answering a different exam question, which is the one you asked, which is, would it have made a difference if we'd had the challenge model data? I think the answer is no. Were they valuable? I think they are. I mean, we've learnt some about the biology. You can't very easily, in the wild, follow from the moment of exposure to the pathogen through what's happening and the evolution of that. It's really difficult to do that in the wild. And I think we've learned a lot about the biology. The Oxford end of the COVID challenge models has been looking at the impact of immunity on challenge and showing the extraordinarily difficult problem of even infecting people who've got some immunity either from previous infection or vaccination. So I think this, it is incredibly valuable to have challenge models in the pandemic. And I think you're right that if there'd been a new generation of vaccines that needed to be licensed once a broadly vaccine rollout, there's a much lower rate of COVID, it's very difficult for that next generation to move ahead. So the challenge models are a way of being able to look at future vaccines even when you've got the first set going, that have already been approved through the more standard route. So I think the challenge models are very valuable. I'm not sure that in the circumstances we've just had, given how things panned out, it would have made a difference.
Can I just add, from Wellcome's perspective, I think we were really keen to see whether we could fund COVID challenge studies, and at the time we did a lot of due diligence to kind of understand the trajectory of the pandemic, and also understanding that, with the vaccine rollout, we weren't sure whether the vaccines were going to work. And so Wellcome, we took the decision to kind of fund COVID challenge studies, and in the end, the timing worked really well in that we were able to fund the production of the Delta challenge agent, which is now going through characterization.
Can I just make one comment on your first question on the barriers? I really think that one of the biggest barriers at the beginning was funding. There was no funder there on day one saying we're going to fund challenge models. The other thing which is critical, and that was not criticism of the Wellcome, well maybe it is, The other point was that we needed to make the decision to do the manufacturing on day one. Even if later on it turned out that perhaps people didn't have the appetite to do the challenge studies, if you waste 3 months or 4 months on the manufacturing, once you have made the decision, you waste a lot of time, where there's a lot of lives being lost. So I hope at the beginning of the next pandemic, we decide to fund manufacturing for challenge models and have money available to do them if the appetite becomes appropriate to then move ahead with challenge models, so that we're already ahead of the game in the way that we weren't this time.
Agreed. I also think the discussion around whether they need to be GMP produced or not is also something that needs to happen ahead of time. But I also think at the time that when the decision was made to do a challenge agent under GMP, there were very few manufacturers who were willing to manufacture the SARS-CoV-2 challenge agent under GMP. I think mostly down to reputational risk. So that's also something that I think needs to be kind of thought ahead of time, and maybe those discussions with manufacturers, with regulatory authorities needs to happen, and I think the report recommendations kind of lend itself to that.
And I wanted to ask you about this, about producing the agents and why that is such a barrier, and you've already kind of touched on it. Is there anything you would like to see happen, as you've said, I guess, discussions to start ahead of time, but to kind of reduce that barrier? What are the main kind of things you would like to see happen?
With regards to the production of the challenge
of the agents.
I think it's really important to start the discussions with the manufacturers, as I just mentioned early on, to have them already desensitized to the fact that challenge studies can be useful in a pandemic, and that the reputational risk is quite low given the experience with COVID. I think just maintaining the collaborations that have occurred through COVID. I think there was a lot of time spent developing collaboration agreements with industry, with manufacturers, with all the parties that needed to be involved. So I think there's a lot to do in terms of building on the work that was done with COVID.
And is that being done? And whose job is that?
I just wanted to say a little bit about this process around the GMP. So GMP is the regulatory framework around manufacturing to make sure that if you produce a challenge agent, a virus, that when you give it to someone, it does contain what in the vial, it does contain what you say it does. It's not contaminated, it's the right dose and that sort of thing. So you know exactly what you're doing. That regulatory framework is an important one. Whether it has to be fully GMP, which is all of the bits of paperwork that go around it, but you do want to have certainty that you're not going to contaminate someone with something else rather than what's in the agent. So it does have to have some form of oversight to get there. The barrier to manufacturing is largely a funding one. When we think about all studies that we do for challenge, we're talking usually about £1 to £3 or £4 million to make one lot of challenge agent. So for a funder who's got limited resources, it's a big decision to decide to put them into manufacturing a challenge agent. But in a pandemic, we should be looking at the big economic hit that the pandemic causes. I saw a figure the other day that it was 137 trillion on the global economy, so a few million for a challenge agent is nothing. But we need to get that sort of thinking in place.
I guess that's easier said than done when you're thinking about pre-pandemic preparedness. You don't have that kind of urgency in the funding that comes along with, a global emergency. Chris, did you want to add something?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So on the GMP side, I think the problem with GMP is a regulatory one, right? So if you're testing vaccines and you are using a challenge agent to do that, then the medicines regulator, wherever you are, will want to be reassured that your challenge agent, as well as the vaccine you're testing, has been manufactured to the highest quality standards. And the ones that they understand are GMP. Anything else, they feel it's not, they don't feel there are guarantees about the process, the testing, and so on. And so I think there's some work to do in discussion with regulators, which is, I'm sure people will understand, takes a long time and iterative discussions to see whether they would accept an accelerated GMP, abiding by GMP principles, but not necessarily having all the very arduous paperwork that's associated with GMP. And then your question about whether any of this work is happening now. It is. So we're working, Oxford and Imperial are working with Wellcome, are working with CEPI. We're in discussions about how to set up a sort of collaborative network to do this work. But as you can tell, it's not straightforward. It requires quite substantial resources, time and funding and so on to address all of these points, and there are so many of them as well. So we are starting that process, and I think there is some real motivation and momentum going into that, but it's a work in progress.
I mean, just one nuance on that, in that the challenge agents are actually not regulated in the UK. The reason for that is they don't appear in UK legislation. That's different from most other countries. And so I think that's actually a problem, but it would require a change in the law to have some regulation, and that could be specific around in what circumstances do you not have to have full GMP around it. But I mean, that's the slowness of the process, I think, that Chris is talking about, to actually get to a point where there was a regulatory framework is a big deal.
But then that also introduces some risk when you're looking at it from a speed perspective. The more regulators you have who are assessing, the more chance that somebody will disagree. You may have quite broad consensus, but you only need one person to disagree, and then that derails your whole program. And so I think, again, it's to do with preparedness and education and discussions in advance. We need to have that ongoing relationship with the regulators so that that doesn't happen to scupper everything at the last minute.
So I think it's interesting to reflect the direction of travel that we've been on over the past couple of decades has been very much towards enhancing the regulations, enhancing the stringency with which these things are controlled. When we first infected volunteers around the lab back in the early 1990s, there was very little regulation, actually. We just asked various postdocs and students if they would mind having the virus. We thawed the virus out and we put it into their noses and we let them go home. It was really very regulation light. And I wonder, from the ethical point of view, whether anyone would like to comment about what it would take to, unreel these regulations which we have to adhere to now. What sort of state of emergency would it require for somebody to make very rapid decisions that actually, the very careful ethical frameworks that we work under are actually too laborious, and we just need to crack on.
Well, I mean, I can speak to that as a vaccine developer, that we have an extraordinary environment in the UK for both ethics and regulation. In approving clinical trials in the pandemic, the MHRA, the UK regulator, took around about 7 days. And I have absolute confidence that if they had challenge models as part of that framework in a pandemic, that they would do a similar process of that approach. So I'm not worried about regulation. I think it's a good thing to make sure the standards of what we're giving to people are at the highest possible level, without any suggestion that they weren't when you were thawing stuff out in the lab and giving it to people. And I think from the Ethics Committee point of view, again, the Department of Health asked the National Ethics Committee in the pandemic to respond rapidly, and we had trials that were approved by the ethics committees who sat at an ad hoc way in 4 days. And so they did the same review they would normally do. There was no difference in process. It's just you didn't have to wait for a month or two for the next committee. So I think actually the system worked very well in the pandemic around the ethics and regulation for that approval process. Now, it may be more complicated if there's a challenge study and there are questions, and so there's a bit of back and forth. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, that we actually do want the ethics committees to be looking carefully at what we're doing and thinking about it.
Yeah, so I was just going to comment on that. So obviously, I think the whole ethical review process is critically important. And actually, it was extremely helpful in the development of the SARS-CoV-2 human challenge study, because it really helped us pinpoint and refine the scientific value, what we were doing in the context of vaccines starting to be rolled out, new variants coming along. These were things which we had thought about, but maybe had not thought about in as much depth as when the ethics committee came back and said, this is a question that you need to answer. So I completely agree that regulation is a good thing overall. But the reason I commented about the potential derailing is that during the study we had this experience. We as the WHO ethical framework had set out, we undertook widespread peer review, or asked for peer review, and on one occasion there was a pretty categorical, we do not agree with this, the way that you're doing this study, and we would only agree to you doing it if you did it this way, which we disagreed with, and many of the other stakeholders and reviewers also disagreed with. And so, if that had been a critical approval, then the whole thing would have just stopped there. And then I'm not sure that the current process really has an adequate appeal process where you can say, well, the ethics committee think this, and the expert community think this, but you think the opposite. How do we bring those two conflicting views together? And I'm not sure that if we'd run into that, I don't think we could have solved it.
Another major barrier that I think we've seen, or another issue, is ensuring that the participants actually represent the population. I know this is an issue across all research, this isn't challenge study specific, but how can researchers work to overcome those potential barriers to make sure that underrepresented groups are included in these studies?
I mean, we make a lot of effort to reach out to the different communities, usually ethnic minority communities, which are the hardest to access. But I do think there's a lot more work needs to be done. The way it was solved in the US through vaccine development, and obviously in the pandemic there weren't challenge studies there, was for the funder, which was the National Institute for Health, to require the developers to recruit a certain proportion from the different ethnic minorities, or not so minority in the US, the different ethnicities. And when they had filled their quota of the usual white American, they then had to continue enrolling, even if it took longer, for those minority groups. So I mean, that's one way that it's been addressed, but I think much better is in peacetime to be reaching out to those communities and involving them in research, understanding what the barriers are, and making sure there's better communication so that we do better in the future. But it's definitely a problem in all parts of the UK that you tend to get an overrepresentation of white.
Communication seems to be a running theme here. Are we doing enough, do you think, to communicate with the public right now? Is that what this is about here? And whose role does that kind of fall under? Is that everybody's job?
I think communication is really vital, and I think the Science Media Centre have been enormously helpful. I think that's another great national asset. In addition to all the key people who encouraged this work to be done during the pandemic, and I think also the teams of communication experts that we have at our various universities and at Wellcome Trust and so on. I think there's been a real growth in this area, and that we have to have the public engaged and informed, and the best way to do that is through communication teams.
So from Wellcome's perspective, and I really like the idea of having a quota, but we also have EDI as a real goal for our funding, and so we do ask what the EDI recruitment strategies are like. And in terms of Wellcome's funding, in terms of human infectious studies overall, we do encourage stakeholder public engagement to happen routinely as a build-up to challenge studies, and for that to be ongoing engagement, and so you feed back to the community what the results are, etc., so that you maintain the level of public trust.
So yeah, absolutely. I think ongoing communication is really important, and what we tend to do, unfortunately, is that when we've got findings or when we've got a new study, there's a spike in communication, and then when we're just chugging along doing the work, then we kind of put our heads down and do the work. And maybe I think what would be really helpful is to engage maybe early career researchers and other a more diverse range of the people who are involved in the work, not just the sort of, the chief investigators and so on, to actually be able to do that as a more ongoing project. And I'm keen to sort of develop that. In terms of involving more diverse volunteer participation and involvement, I mean, actually, in London, we do relatively well. So we reviewed our recruitment over the last 10 years and really capture the proportions of different ethnicities from our local population. But the problem is challenge studies are generally small, so small numbers. So it still only means that you get a handful of people from, for example, black populations and so on. And then it's hard to really make any really strong conclusions from those. So yeah, I think there's a lot more work to do, and maybe perhaps as human challenge studies get more funded and a more diverse range of people come into the field to use those models for more innovative or wide-ranging questions, then there can be particular study designs where you particularly target and look at the differences between ethnicities as your specific research question. But that's not something that we have historically been able to do very well.
I think it's worth saying that. I mean, I've done tons of media interviews over the last 2 decades on challenge studies. The COVID challenge had global reach, the idea that it might happen. But still, if I go to a dinner party, people don't know that the COVID challenge happened, and they don't know that I do challenge studies, or that anyone has ever done one in research. So despite what seems like a lot of media interest, we still don't seem to have got engagement from most people that's actually happened or happening. So we do have to do more.
And in terms of communication and funding and kind of making sure the infrastructure is there, with the COVID pandemic kind of fresh in everyone's mind and everyone having some kind of experience of what it's been like to live through the past 3 years, is this kind of a unique opportunity to convince people that this is worth the funding, this is worth ongoing communication, this is worth doing challenge studies in peacetime? Do we have a kind of unique moment right now to make a real difference in the future?
I mean, in some senses, yes. I mean, I do think funders are particularly interested in this, and Shobana maybe wants to talk to that. Governments are interested but increasingly distracted with other things, and I don't know about the public. I think most of us have had enough of the pandemic and want to talk about something else.
No, I agree totally. I think someone made the point that these studies can be done in peacetime, and they are routine. They're not so dissimilar to clinical trials. So they are a clinical trial, and there's nothing inherently different about them. So I think it's really important to kind of take the moment now and be able to kind of build on the COVID challenge studies that have been done so far, and to just kind of normalise it so that it doesn't seem such a novel thing when the next pandemic hits.
And I mean, you said in your introduction that the UK is a unique position in having so many challenge studies running. If you go to most other countries in Europe, there has never been a challenge study, and some there never will be because of the position of their ethics committees and their governments. So even in that context, it's quite hard to make sure that people are aware of it.
But I think there has been a step change in understanding, at least within a limited range of stakeholders, about the potential role and the specific advantages of human challenge versus field studies of any kind. And I take the point that when a pandemic is raging, there are lots of cases, but they're cases at all different stages of their infection. You don't know what they were exposed to, whether it was a big dose or a small dose. You sometimes don't know what the strain is. So all of those things make it very difficult to study in detail a lot of the questions that we want to answer. Having said that, I think there is a window of opportunity, and we're trying to take advantage of that, all the people here on the panel, to sort of get some of these critical things done before that interest dries up. And I hope that that interest won't wane completely, but in the meantime, we'll be doing our utmost to try and set up those processes to expedite the next time.
I wanted to touch on the idea that the UK is a bit of an outlier in terms of maybe the rest of Europe. Why is that the case? And I guess why are these studies seen so differently, let's say, from other research? I took part in a vaccine trial myself. It had risks, and I had to weigh those up. And I wonder why we see these so differently.
I think part of it is historical. Going back to the early days, we saw Jenner doing the experiment on the boy Phipps, but also the Common Cold Unit, which was set up in the aftermath of the Second World War, when there was this facility built in the countryside, which was intended for the many injured people that would result from the invasion by the Germans, and that was never used as a hospital, and was then donated to the UK MRC in order to do common cold research. And I think people have grown up with the knowledge that this sort of common cold challenge work has been going on, and it's sort of embedded in the British psyche, I think, and also the sort of can-do spirit that we have. We're prepared to do things which are slightly risky, but it'd be interesting to hear from some of the volunteers perhaps about their motivations.
Anyone like to add anything, Chris?
I think in the UK, there is a culture of pragmatism and an understanding of opportunity costs as well. So it's easy to say no, and you're not going to ever be accused of having caused anybody harm by just not doing it. But I think we have a system which is built up over many decades that appreciates that not doing something can potentially be as harmful as doing something. And I think that is built into our regulatory framework. So I think that was a major reason why this kind of work can proceed relatively unimpeded.
Most of the challenge studies have either been funded by the Wellcome Trust or the Medical Research Council, with a little bit from industry. And I think that is another unique part of the UK, that there isn't a Wellcome Trust in most countries. And so having it funder with expertise internally in the funding agencies that understands about the importance of experimental medicine makes a huge difference.
Brilliant. I think I'm going to open up to questions from the audience now. Oh, good, we have lots of hands, that's great. I think there is a roaming mic. Should we go with this lady here first?
Hi, thank you very much for that. I have a question very specifically about the end point of these trials, because, one thing that the COVID, the whole experience has highlighted is the need to focus on vaccines that prevent severe disease rather than infection. And I think this is something that's long overdue, and for diseases like malaria as well, we're starting to move towards that, I think, much more realistic goal. That, of course, creates another problem, because even if we have age groups who are less likely to suffer negative outcomes, if we're testing for precisely that rather than infection blocking endpoints, that creates a whole other layer of complexity. So I wonder how we can start thinking about these challenge studies in the context of preventing severe disease. So that's one question. And the other thing, with regard, I can't resist, with regard to diversity and ethnicity, I mean, I would worry from the other point of, you know, if you're, particularly if there's some remuneration for this, that you'll end up exploiting ethnic groups who are underprivileged ethnic groups for these studies. So I wonder if those 2 points might be.
Perhaps just to come to the first comment, I think the whole reason why the regulators want vaccine studies, if we just look at the pandemic we just had, in the field, is to address the question of the diversity in the population, the things Chris mentioned about the variation in dose that people get exposed to, and so on. And of course the other bit is hopefully to capture some severe disease endpoints. Now, none of the vaccines we've used in the UK had adequately powered studies to have death or even hospitalisation as an endpoint with much certainty around it. And I think that comes to exactly your point, that the difficulty is that even in a very large study, we're talking about 25 to 50,000 people in these trials, we still don't get enough endpoints to answer the critical question, which was pressure on the NHS and death, which are the things we really want to know. So you could only get an answer to, could we have an impact on infection, which until variants arrive is okay, but some future pandemics may have variants emerging much more rapidly. And you could have a perfectly good vaccine that stops death, but you can't detect it in a smaller scale trial. And I think if I was doing it again, I would do a trial that had 100,000 or 200,000 people in it, not one that had 25,000. And the only reason why we didn't do that in the pandemic wasn't a funding one. It was because we couldn't make enough doses early in the pandemic. We didn't have the manufacturing capacity for making the vaccine. But I think the role of the challenge study is very different. It's not about answering all of those questions because you can't do that quickly. It is about trying to help give you some understanding about whether a new vaccine you've developed could work, particularly in a situation where you've got a low attack rate in the population, where you can't get your answer, and the challenge model becomes critical to answer that question.
Peter. You're just going to have to infer, aren't you, from these challenge models, whether it's something that you can use to prevent severe disease, and then go ahead and do that, I think, under these.
Well, if it were to block infection, then you will also be stopping severe disease. But it may give you an initial look. Now,
what I'm saying is we couldn't have established. We had to go ahead with it before establishing whether it could stop severe disease.
I mean, there is only one vaccine developed so far in peacetime that has used challenge models. That's one of the cholera vaccines, called Vaxchora, which was developed using a challenge model, and it's only used for travellers because the studies weren't done in a low-income setting where there's a lot of the cholera. So at the moment, we don't have many examples of challenge specifically for licensing vaccines, but there's lots of challenge done to inform the biology, to tell us which vaccines we should take forward to field trials. As you know, in the malaria field, there's a requirement to go through challenge studies before you can do a field study. So I think that they're very useful to understand what you might use to go forwards.
Peter, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the fundamental point of view of the immunology, trying to understand what the correlates of protection are and whether we have a correlate of protection of sterilizing immunity in something mucosal, that for these mucosally transmitted pathogens, that would be an additional justification, trying to really drill down into the deep immunological understanding, which has, I think, been one of the great benefits. Chris, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I think the point you've made is really important, and we need to understand the role of this model or these models in the whole vaccine development pipeline. And we use cells and we use small animals to test vaccines before they go into humans. And I don't think anybody would disagree that testing a vaccine in a human is more likely to be predictive of the genuine effect finally in the patient population than a mouse, for example. So it's a stepwise process, and we mustn't ask too much of the model. But if it can show, for example, that a vaccinated person has a reduced amount of virus in their nose or in their throat or somewhere else, then that is a strong positive signal that that is a candidate that's worth taking forward into your ultimately very expensive big trial. For your second point, I think we are all very concerned about undue inducement to participate in studies like this, and particularly the COVID challenge studies involved long, 2 weeks or more in quarantine, so in a single room, the participant only seeing study staff and so on. And so we paid people for the amount of time that they spent in those rooms, which ends up being a fairly large amount of money. And I think that there are some safeguards you can build into the structure, and part of the ethical review does think about the appropriateness of compensation and payment of the amount. And we calculate these based on guides such as the minimum wage and so on. But also the whole informed consent process is a very personal one between a clinician, a doctor and a nurse, or a small team, and the volunteers. And we get to spend many hours with those people before they enroll in the study and explore to some extent, their beliefs and their attitudes and so on. So I don't think, although it looks very black and white on paper, in reality there is a sort of human element to it, an assessment by clinical teams whether somebody is coming into a study fully understanding as much as they can what the study will involve, but also their motivations for doing that.
I don't know, Dominic, do you want to say anything on this as well? I'll bring you in.
So I mean, the question of payment is really interesting. One of the questions that we point to in the report is that from an ethical point of view, it's, I think, an important question to ask. And one question to ask is what level of payment would be reasonable, and whether that should change with higher risk studies. So in fact, some of our colleagues in Oxford published a study. In fact, Andy was one of the authors that had been done just prior to the pandemic, but was published early in 2020, looking at the level of payment that the general public thought that participants should be paid relative to the minimum wage, the relative payment that CHIM experts, scientists, thought that participants should be paid, and the public thought that those who were involved in these studies should be paid significantly more than the minimum wage, and that payment should go up if they were involved in higher risk studies. And the experts who were involved in these studies were much more cautious about that. So I think that there's a debate to be had about what level of payment is fair, and there's a kind of contrary argument, which is that it's exploitative not to pay people a reasonable amount for both the time and the risk that they're involved in, that they undertake as part of these trials.
Any more questions? Yeah. There's two just here. Maybe we can take both of them at the same time. Pass them behind you as well.
I'll go first, if that's okay. This is a related question. So I'm Liam Trent. I worked at HP while you were doing the human challenge trial, and now I work in drug development. Sorry, I'm realising I can only hear myself now. But I think it's a really interesting topic in terms of how to compensate volunteers. And sometimes you need to focus on the bits you can control, and minorities will always be less likely to take part in these things because participation is related to sentiment in the population, trust, and even if we control the things that we can and we make sure that, for instance, staffing in quarantine centres is representative, what we can still end up with is studies which aren't representative. So I think the compensation is a situation where you could almost unfairly introduce a bias in order to get a better representation of your population. And I wonder, with you guys as medical professionals, where your comfort level sits on those decisions.
Well, I mean, I think having diverse populations in studies is important. I mean, challenge studies is problematic because it's always small numbers, but generally speaking, in studies, you really want to know that your vaccine works across all populations, because you're going to want to protect people, whatever their genetic background is. So I think you do want to be representative. I mean, I think to some extent in most challenge studies, it's quite hard to find people who want to take part. And so we're pretty happy to have anyone who will come through the door.
Anyone want to add, Peter?
Of course, I mean, there are inherent limitations in the studies that we're doing because we're never going to be choosing people who might be at higher risk. So, you know, we have to recognize that that is a limitation of the human challenge.
So I'd be very uncomfortable about increasing payment to encourage greater participation. I think if there are reasons for people to need more payment, that's a different thing, right? If there's a justified reason why, if we've identified something that is actually stopping people from participating, and we could offer more money to make up for that, then to me that would absolutely fine. But I think it's this horrible grey area, isn't it? At what point does the payment lead to somebody going against their initial judgment and participating in the trial purely because of the money? And it's really difficult to assess that. So I think we, as researchers, we tend to err on the side of caution. But I'm very happy to hear other people's points of view.
Might just mention, when we did these studies 30 years ago, we in one study paid people in proportion to the severity of their symptoms. That was a terrible decision. I wish we'd had ethicists and people to discuss.
That seems very chaotic.
So I'm Mary De Silva. I'm the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department of Health and Social Care, and I'm also part of the NIHR leadership. So I have another money question, but it's not about paying participants, it's about who should pay for the infrastructure for CHIM. And two of the recommendations in the report are quite easy to deliver. They require people to get together and make decisions. That's cool. Number 3, who pays for the long-standing infrastructure, and what does that infrastructure do when we are in an inter-pandemic period? So I'd love your thoughts, particularly how you persuade people to pay for that infrastructure, what useful things you're going to do with it.
Obviously, you should pay for it.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. So NIHR generally doesn't fund CHIM, as we've just learned. I think in peacetime, we're all running challenge models all the time. So I don't think there's a problem with having the facilities that are running, that they are helping develop products which I hope will have an impact on human health, not just here, but in other countries as well. So I don't think there's a reason not to have the facilities in peacetime, because you also want the expertise, the skills in how to do the reviews of challenge studies when a pandemic does come, and the manufacturing. You only get all of that by having stuff going on in peacetime, which is what we do. And it's one of the reasons why the 2 major challenge centres in the UK, Oxford and Imperial, were able to do the COVID challenge, just because we were already all doing challenges.
We should also mention NIHR and the BRCs. I mean, I think these were absolutely vital in steering UK research towards more clinical applied studies, and that's been a dramatic change. And I think Dame Sally Davis should be acknowledged there.
Chris?
But I think funding the built infrastructure is really difficult. So there is a critical lack of quarantine facility in the UK. The reason that we could do this study was the first SARS-CoV-2 challenge study was that by chance there was a ward at the Royal Free Hospital which happened to have the right air handling, which happened to be not being used by the hospital at that point. And the vaccine task force swooped in and made an offer on renting that space. But that was total luck. If that hadn't existed, or if it was full of patients, then we'd have been stuck with 5 beds here, 5 beds there, which is what is actually currently the situation. And if you really want to invest in vaccine development or development of interventions, you can't run studies with only 5 beds, because it will take you 6 months or a year to finish your study. And by that, we're talking about speed, then it's totally hopeless. So we have been exploring with various funds, including NIHR, funding the renovation of space. And I think that, I think it's a collaborative process. We as a university have identified the space, We have an NHS partner which will provide the clinical higher level support. And we're asking around and endeavoring to find the funding for that. But as your question implies, it's not straightforward.
And the Department of Health did fund the refurbishment of our Challenge facility in Oxford. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Sure.
Thanks.
It should come on.
Thanks. Alex McKeown. I'm Deputy Director of the Pandemic Ethics Accelerator, so a colleague of Dominic's at Oxford. Thanks, it's been fantastically interesting. I want to finish with an ethics question, if I may. It picks up on a couple of the points that we heard earlier, and also I think relates to what Professor Openshaw was hinting at earlier on, which is to do with, and it's sort of orthogonal to the issue of like what counts as fair remuneration and what counts as coercive and so on, but it's sort of to do with at what point the stringency of informed consent procedures break down, right? So we know that, knowing the risk profile of COVID-19, you could make a relatively rational decision, assuming you're not at high risk, to take part in a challenge trial, and you could decide whether the money on offer was reasonable to take the risk. But what about, in relation to this hypothetical pandemic X, what about something that's really, really incredibly lethal? It makes me think of Catch-22, because of course in Catch-22, you're not allowed to. You can't fly if you're crazy, but but the only people who would fly are crazy. So there's this kind of, let's say there's something that was so lethal that that there are people agreeing to take part in challenge trials, but I mean, it sort of relates to the question about protection for people who are vulnerable in certain kinds of ways. Because I mean, would you just say, well, it's sort of either you're very, very brave, or you're crazy, and at that point, is it sort of moot whether which they are? Would you just be grateful, as you said, you can be grateful for people to come through the door? I just wonder whether at what the point of at what level of risk you sort of throw the stringency out the window, as it were.
To keep the answer.
Well, I mean, so just very, very briefly, I think if you've got a very high case fatality rate and a very high attack rate, you just need to go and test your vaccines in the population. I think the issue probably that's more pertinent to your question is if you have a low attack rate, and so it's going to take you a long time to get an answer in the wild, would that be acceptable to then run the challenge studies? And I think we'd come to an ethicist to ask for advice on that. But it is more than the ethics. It's also institutional risk. I think a lot of our institutions would be very concerned about running studies where there's a high chance of people dying in the studies. And that I think is something we would, even though it might be of great public benefit to do them, that would be another component which we'd need to factor in. And we haven't really sensitized institutions to that sort of question.
Well, I think in addition to that, there's personal risk to the doctors and nurses who are doing these studies and taking care of participants. It goes against our most fundamental beliefs to cause the risk of death, a significant risk of death. So I think you'd be hard to find a clinician who'd be willing to run that kind of study.
And as a funder, I think we'd also be really uncomfortable to fund a study that wasn't scientifically and ethically justified.
Brilliant. I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you for all the questions.
Is this on? Great. I can't believe we're already at the end of this event. Feels unreal, but I really want to take this moment to thank everyone who's taken the time out to attend this event and be part of these important discussions. Can we just get another huge round of applause for our brilliant speakers and for the moderator? I also want to take this opportunity to thank my brilliant team who's been working super hard behind the scenes for the past 3 months to help put this event together, and I'm so proud to see what the outcome is,
especially Danica, I know we spent a lot of midnights working on the finer details recently. And also events production lead Danny, who's most likely traveling around the US at the moment. As we close this evening here today, I really want to take a moment to bring a sentiment into this room. So I grew up in a remote village where my grandmother was a nurse. And after she got married, she still decided to practice because despite against the odds, which, you know, a nurse practitioner in a remote village in India at the time was unheard of, she was the only option for a lot of women who couldn't access healthcare otherwise. And after each patient that she would help, she always used to say this phrase, which is, "Thank you for the opportunity to serve." And I truly believe that's what this event has been for us today. At the risk of sounding ironic, given I'm also a biochemist by training, I know we touched on a lot of important details today, the technical, the ethics, and kind of what the future of CHIMs for the UK looks like. But I really hope we also take a moment to kind of appreciate that no one of us would be here if it's not for the bravery and moral agencies of a lot of the volunteers who put themselves forward to take part in those studies. And really, we should be taking a more forthcoming and active approach at championing their rights and their voices. And that's something I would really encourage. We're really fortunate that 3 of the volunteers who took part in the COVID-19 study, Alistair, Jacob, and Paul, are with us here today. So I really encourage you, to go up to them, ask them what it is that motivated them to take these risks for the general public and for the benefit of science. And with that note, I really do hope all of you will join us for the reception following this event, and continue to be part of the lots of things we have in the pipeline for the rest of the year as well. And then with that note, I'll say thank you so much for being part of this, and thank you for the opportunity to serve. It's been a pleasure.